It's obvious that you've got this fascination around the middle of organizations. They create this sort of momentum and drive and need to be explored. So tell me a little bit more about what sort of put your focus there.
Because you're often promoted on the basis of your expertise, but the expertise that you need in this middle role is very different to the expertise that you needed leading a team and the expertise you needed as an individual contributor. And so that thing that you've relied on, your superpower, stops becoming your superpower. You know, people talk about the middle manager as being on the bridge between the two groups, the junior groups, the senior groups. You've grown up in the team, I call it the village, and now you're moving out, you've got your promotion and you're moving out of the village and you're living on this bridge because there's this senior team over there. You might call them the city. It's got some bright lights, you think, but you're living on the bridge. You're not in the village and you're not in the city. You're kind of in between the two.
And if you've recently got onto the bridge, what are the sort of key capacities, characteristics that help you flourish?
When I start off thinking about, what do managers need? I think we all start with
Hello, Judy, and welcome to The Power Between.
Hello, Roddy. Thank you for having me here.
It's great to have you, Judy. This podcast series focuses on that section of people in organizations who are frequently overlooked, at least in terms of leadership development, and so left somewhat under-supported. The mid-level leaders. And yet they carry so much of the weight of organizational success and often get blamed generically, but rarely specifically for organizational failures. For that reason, I'm really delighted to have Judy with us today. Firstly, Judy has been a mid-level leader herself, so speaks with full appreciation of the role. But much more importantly, currently, she's a manager and leadership development lead at one of the government's large central organizations. However, before we jump into that, it would be great, Judy, to learn a bit about your journey into your current role. You've been there, I think, for 7 years, and before that, you were in the non-profit sector. Tell us a little bit about that, if you can.
Thank you, Roddy. Yeah, so I started off studying kind of business and HR, and I always assumed that I would just end up, because of that, I would end up in an HR role. And then I just had this very early experience, not through work, but through some volunteering that I was doing, where I was asked to run a workshop. And I remember being absolutely terrified and feeling this is a really alien thing for me, but then doing it and being so excited and delighted with what that felt like and the outcomes of it. It was like I'd very quickly found my place. My place was more about learning and development than it was about HR. And that was, a little bit of a shock to me, but also a delightful one. And so that led me then into trying to focus much more on learning and development roles than HR roles. And some of the work I've done is been in small charities where you do lots of everything. So it crosses across both. But as you go to larger organizations and you're able to specialize more, I've focused much only on learning and development. And I think, what are the reasons that I had that surprise? And I sometimes take it back to, as a teenager, I did some drama, and I was actually in a play that won the Southwest Hearts drama competition in about 1980 something. I show my age. And I always wondered, well, was there a connection? Because again, that was quite an unnatural thing for the teenage Judy to be doing and enjoying. So I think there's something very performative about learning and development. It can be a lot of fun to be with a group in that kind of way. I've also got lots of teachers in my family, so I sometimes also wonder if there's a genetic link that takes us back there. But essentially, so I started off just really enjoying being with groups of people and taking them through a learning journey and all the things that you see. You see the light bulbs, you see the things clicking, you see people solving their own problems. And if you work in an organisation and you see a smaller organisation where you know people, then you see the journey that they're making as you see people progressing through the organisation, and that you've had some part in that. That's really delightful. And so, from starting in a kind of smaller local charity, I then moved to a national charity. So then that brings you an additional challenge of, well, how do you do this when people are spread all across the UK? So, how do you engage a team in Glasgow with a team in London? That kind of experience. And obviously that led to lots of travelling, which was also lots of fun. And I think that experience really has served me well when we came to COVID and hybrid, because I already had quite a lot of experience of how do you do things when people are not all in the same place, just without some of the great tech that we've got now. And from there, I wanted to move to somewhere bigger to understand, well, how do you do this learning and development, this management development, when you don't know everyone? When the group is so big, you can't get your arms around them, you can't know who everybody is. And so that's what led me to my current organisation. I think the other part, if we talk about a journey, the other part of the journey is that, of course, the more that you spend in learning and development, the more you start to realise that it's such a small part of the picture of what helps people do well at work. And so, what helps a manager do well at work. And that is partly about the learning and development support that they get, but it's also about the other support and the system and the organisation and how easy or difficult it makes it for people to do well. So you start to have an organisational lens. And again, that gives you a whole big bunch of levers that you can work with to help people do well. And that's, so it's another exciting lens. And I think that's what keeps it all so fresh. So it's not the same job that I was doing when I started.
Absolutely. And I'm interested in unpicking that too. But it's interesting you mentioned that the teenage Judy and the performative part, because in a previous episode, we've spoken with Paul Williamson, who is director at ATG Entertainment, the theatre company. And he was talking very much about that same performative element that it's important to encourage and sort of foster. But not necessarily as the central pillar, but certainly as part of one of the capacities. So it's great to hear that sort of resonating through. But I think, it's obvious that you've got this fascination around the middle of organizations, create this sort of momentum and drive and need to be explored. So tell me a little bit more about, put your focus there.
So I think when I start off thinking about, what do managers need? I think we all start with what are the people-related skills that they need. And so you put in place, people talk about accidental managers, but I think most organisations actually do have support and learning in place for new line managers. So the accident is how someone became a manager more than, what happens to them once they become. And so that's the starting point. But again, this thing back to what else influences how easy or difficult it is for somebody to be a good manager. And of course, so you turn your attention to the role that their own manager plays. So that was my kind of entry into this interest. So what's the role of a manager of managers? And we've spent, I spent quite a lot of time trying to unpick that and articulate that. And we've got it down to this notion of, you're there to provide a role model, you're there to support this manager in making sure that they have help with the things that are challenging about being a manager, and that they're accessing the right kind of organizational support, and they're making time for their own development as a manager. And you've got this kind of assurance role in the organisation, are the managers that report to you kind of doing the things that we expect managers should be doing? And are they kind of following up on the challenging stuff? So you've got this role model support and assure model. So you spend some time with that middle group. But again, that's still about people management. How are they managing the people? And so, when you spend some time with that group and they start also talking about what else matters to them, what else are they finding challenging and difficult? And so, when you start to look at their role in the whole, and that causes me some really interesting thoughts about, what is it that people think, what's the perception of what it's going to be like when you make that step up, you move from managing a team to perhaps, being in the middle, perhaps managing a group of teams or a function or a department. What do we think that's going to be like? And then what's the reality? I think people have often been quite shocked by the reality. And some of that, I think, is because, quite naturally, we want to progress, we want to make those steps up. And so we're interested in the role without necessarily having the stepping up that's needed kind of articulated well for us. So we think it's going to happen when we get that middle role, where we assume that it's going to give us more authority and more influence, and we're going to have more access to this inner circle where all the decisions are made and people are going to listen to us. And all of that perception is with good intention, because we want to do good things in this organisation, and we can see some of the problems that need fixing, and we think that the step up is going to be the place that allows us to do that. So we're going to have more voice, more power, more control, more respect, more influence. And we might understand a bit of how each time you move up, you probably become a bit less of a doer and a bit more of a coordinator. So we might, there's that thing that happens as well. And that can be, I think, challenging for people, because you're often promoted on the basis of your expertise, but the expertise that you need in this middle role is very different to the expertise that you needed leading a team and the expertise you needed as an individual contributor. And so that thing that you've relied on, your superpower, actually stops becoming your superpower.
That's really interesting because, and you've seen this, as you said, when you were describing your own journey, you started in a small organization, went to a larger organization, and now you're really in quite a big organization in terms of headcount. And you mentioned, that the issue there is that you stop being able to know everyone. So your connections to people become weaker, and yet your responsibility grows. And I also like that bit that you say around, we think as we go up the hierarchy, that people will listen to us more. Whereas perhaps actually we need to be doing more listening. How do you try and get people to manage that transition?
I think there's something about kind of helping people recognize what the new role and challenge is. And so, what's it really like to be at that level? And it's not about, knocking people's dreams. It's just helping them navigate this new world that they're in. And so, the reality is that people can feel quite squeezed. They can feel part of, whereas they were once part of a team, they're now, who am I and where am I and who are my people now? And so, and organizations quite rightly will build perhaps networks of people in the middle so that there's a support group and a peer group there for you. That's a helpful thing. I think helping people think about, okay, so what does success look like at this level? And this is very often the people in the middle are perceived as the people that help the organization get stuff done. They are bringing strategy from the senior team to the delivery teams. So they're making the organization stuff happen. And that's often a perception of, probably rightly so, a perception of them. And then helping them help. So I think the thing that we need to organizations do is help people understand why that's not simple, why that's not an easy thing to do. Because it sounds very logical. You're just this translator between the two groups. And I don't think that's often the reality. It seems a very top-down approach, but also it's just not that easy.
And that coordinator role, it can be perhaps feel a little bit sort of amorphous or nebulous, sort of difficult, intangible anyway, if you're coming from a doing role. And as a result, do you see that people struggle to accept that is a part of their new sort of job requirement? And that presumably is also what pushes people into sort of more micromanagement type, because it feels more like doing than the coordinating part.
Can do, and it's there's all sorts of things that go on. I think it's a similar step to when you first become a manager. It's more amplified. I think you're told, all the literature and all the training tells you to empower people and to delegate and to do things through your people, but it can be very hard to let go of things that you've enjoyed doing, things that you love, things that you've built up yourself. It can be hard to let go of some of that control of being the decision maker on every aspect of something, and to let people do things that might be in a way that's perhaps not the way that you would do it, as long as, with good outcomes, but just have a different approach, think that different things are important, emphasize different aspects of something. So there is whilst there's a perception that we're gaining more control, in some ways you might need to let go of some control to empower others. We need to lead through other people.
Explain to us, or share with us, if you can, some of the ways that you try and enable that. I mean, is that purely or mostly on a one-to-one basis that one does that, or can you do that more on a cohort level too?
I think there's very definitely something about peer groups for people at that level. I think it's an isolated position. And I often use this analogy. People talk about the middle manager as being on the bridge, in a bridge, the bridge between the two groups, the junior groups, the senior groups. And I think you can build on that analogy to really understand it. So, if you've grown up in the team, in the village, I call it the village. So where the things happen, and you've got to know people and they know you, and you understand how things tick and works in the context of that village. And now you're moving out, you've got your promotion and you're moving out of the village, and you're living on this bridge because there's this senior team over there, and you might call them the city. So that's the city, and it's got some bright lights, you think. but you're living on the bridge, and so you're not in the village and you're not in the city. You're kind of in between the two. That's this middle thing that we talk about, and sometimes the squeezed middle that we talk about. And so you can appear, to city for the village and to village for the cities. There's something about how you've aligned yourself and where you align yourself and what people. So it's not about who you are, but it's also about how people see you. So there's some work to do, I think, around understanding that position, about understanding influence, and how influence works, and how it's not a measure. Influence isn't about power and control. It is about relationships, and how whether people see themselves as sharing something with you, whether there's a shared identity. So I'm really influenced by the work of Alex Haslam, social identity leadership. It's worth anybody's time to go and have a look at the work they've been doing there. But articulating leadership as a process of influence that we achieve when we're able to build a shared identity with groups. So you're in the middle. How do you build an identity with both the people in the village and the people in the city?
Absolutely. Alex Haslam's brilliant. He wrote that recent paper also on zombie leadership as well, which is well worth taking a look at. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. But I really like this idea of the bridge and neither being on one side or the other anymore. Bridges, of course, are transitions from one bank to the other. But for most people, we find our mid-level leadership is where they find themselves. And not everyone can get to the bright lights of the city. Not everyone wants to get to the bright lights of the city, having got quite close to it and seen them. So, I mean, is the bridge also a comfortable place to remain, to stay? Or is the idea in most people's heads that you're transitioning when you're there?
Everyone, I think, everybody has very different motivations. I think people often find their place in an organisation and they're content with that place. So not everybody is striving for the city. And I think we need to be content with that. So we shouldn't expect everyone to be striving for the city. And so, organisations need to think about not just development in a very linear sense of progressing to the next step all the time, but how you help people grow in a role, how you help people stay engaged and motivated in a role. And to see that as a good thing, people who are performing well, really solid, reliable, and content with what they're doing. That sounds like gold dust.
Absolutely.
And they exist, yeah.
So I think perhaps we should be looking at this bridge as a Rialto bridge or an old London bridge, one with houses and shops and an activity on it too. So it's a place to be as much as a transition. Now, I think that's a really useful, the bridge metaphor, which is important to understand that, which camp you're in or not in and between. If you are there, and if you've recently got onto the bridge, what are the sort of key capacities, characteristics that help you flourish, do you think? And what can we do to try and encourage those in people?
So I think, the relationship thing is really important, how you build a sense of we and us with both groups. But, I think the things that we need to be good at, I think, are much more about a mindset than they are kind of technical skills in many ways. So, the bridge, I think, is often a more uncertain place than the village or even the city. So, and uncertainty as a thing, as a tension that we need to become more comfortable with and be able to live with and navigate through, as opposed to a thing that can be fixed. So I think, being able to live with some uncomfortableness, some tension, some uncertainty, I think all of those are kind of mindset shifts, that not everything is a problem that can be fixed. Not everything has do A plus B and you will get C. I think there's something about understanding this kind of reality of organisations, that things are not always as neat and tidy as we would want them to be. And that's because we're talking about a system, a whole big system. So I think understanding a bit more about systems theory thinking in general, but also your own system. So how does it work here? What are the structures, the approaches, the governance, the stakeholder engagement work that actually serves you well in this organisation? So there's and all of this kind of takes me back to peer groups. I think, connection with other people who are doing what you're trying to do, perhaps not the exact same job, but who are in that same position. And I think that kind of development is probably much more helpful than, lots of workshops and training and things that we think are going to give us the answers. I think a good workshop these days asks more questions than it gives answers.
Content is often overemphasized in these sessions. It's not unimportant, but it's not just about the content. It's much more about the discussion, really, and the sharing. So a lot of this, I think, is about confidence building, isn't it? It's allowing people to be comfortable, as you say, with that ambiguity, with the not knowing, with the uncertainty.
Yes.
And that, yes, the peer groups are really powerful to enable that. But I mean, we also select our leaders often on different criteria from that. We frequently select leaders on their ability to appear sort of absolutely confident and certain. I mean, Alex Haslam did that wonderful paper around the Royal Marines selecting leaders, and the people who were selected were not the ones who their peer group would have selected. And there's something interesting in that too.
What we see a lot in organisations is more understanding of the importance of behaviours. So, recruitment should help people understand what's expected in terms of behaviours in any kind of role, but a stepping up role, and then be testing for that kind of behaviour through the process, be testing for those behaviours as much as kind of technical skill or ability. And I think we do tend to see more and more of that now.
I mean, are you doing anything either in your current organization or in previous organizations that sort of enable people to grow that confidence around ambiguity, around uncertainty? It still seems to be something that deep in the back of our minds, we feel we need to show that we're in charge and control. And often it's in fact showing that we're in it together and we need to find a solution together is more productive approach.
I think that there's a lot of call for more authenticity and vulnerability in leaderships, which again is a very interesting thing, because the stereotype would be that we would want to look to our leader as knowing, being the person that knew and was it, like you say, was in control and had the plan and had the path. That's the stereotype of leadership. But I think what we're hearing more and more is that actually people would like to see more authenticity and more vulnerability of not always knowing and being open about not always knowing, and seeking the support of groups and teams to help make things clear.
And that sort of role modeling needs to happen too. My hope is, because I mean, those of us who have been studying the sector for a good long while, this has been the textbook basis for good leadership, as it's been discussed for at least the last 2 decades and probably 3 or 4. But the hope is we create generations of better leaders because they are role modeling on leaders who are themselves better, and that comes through. Do you see that happening, or do you still see most people coming in as sort of the warrior young guns which is our sort of natural, instinctive idea of leadership, and that needs to be changed? So are people more seeing better leadership above them and then modifying their behaviors? Or do most people still come in and need to start at ground zero?
I mean, it's a question of building self-awareness. We talk about emotional intelligence quite a lot. So I think there's often a difference between what you might think you're doing, how you might perceive yourself, how open I might perceive myself, and how other people might experience me. So I think there's a lot of very good intention. I think sometimes some of that intention can get a bit lost. And so, the second role, if you think about help develop better managers and leaders, is about building more awareness of how you're perceived, what your impact is, being aware of your own kind of triggers and your own tendencies, and being far more intentional. So again, if I take you back to the village and the city, being far more intentional about how you're showing up in both of those places. And I think that's needs, some space and time. That kind of self-reflection and work on yourself does need some space and time. And that's something that can be sometimes difficult to carve out for people.
Yeah. And we see that a lot. I mean, we run here at Ideas for Leaders, the sustainable leadership community for mid-level managers. And one of the challenges is ensuring that those people have the space and time to attend. And that is a sort of cultural input, I think, from organization. There needs to be an emphasis from quite high up in the organization that these are things that are worth focusing on, and that cutting that time out is not only accepted but respected
And encouraged.
and
Yes.
encouraged.
Yeah. So,
Wow.
working on yourself, working on your own development isn't a nice to have or in your spare time when you can carve something out. It should be an expectation of all of us in organizations.
In practical terms, have you seen that done really well, sort of trying to embed that culture? Is there anything specific that can be done around it?
You have to align kind of intention. So what you say, most organizations send a strong message that development is important, but then are the behaviors that a person experiences around them backing that up, or are they contradicting that? So I think, again, you have to look at kind of the whole of the system. So if you're telling people development is important, but then pulling them off things or asking them to prioritize other things, which of course there'll be times when you have to do that, but as a general rule, are people able to protect their time? And that's a notion, I think, that we talk about, say, protected time. How do we, are people able to, do people have the confidence to be able to protect their time, and the confidence knowing that the organization and their own leaders will back them in that?
And that, the challenge really, isn't it? Because you need the more senior leaders, delivering that approach, that culture. And often from within a leadership development role, that's a difficult group to try and influence, perhaps, is it?
I'm not sure I'd agree with that, because I think everybody sees the importance of learning and development. Those people at the most senior role are also doing things for their own development. And perhaps the important thing is to have those people talk about that a bit more. So people are benefiting from programs themselves. There's lots of people at that level will have a coach, and that's something they find really helpful. And we could be talking about that more.
So in your current role, where is the sort of main focus on supporting middle managers most sort of productively being spent by you as you see it?
I think there's something about helping people move into that role. So again, lots of support for new managers, and what does that mean to be a manager of people? But have we got the same level of support for people as they're moving through different stages in the organization? And I'm less sure about that. The things that you're helping people with at that point is about really understanding what, as said previously, what's the stepping up? What's the right balance of kind of operational delivery and strategic thinking that you need to be thinking about? What does it even mean to be more strategic? So, that again, that's the thing that's always asked for in more senior roles. But what does that mean you're actually doing? So I think we talk about these things, but we never really quite unpick, well, what does that mean? What are the behaviors, the habits, the routines that you should be building for yourself that enable you to do that? Because if you are balancing operational delivery and trying to be strategic at the same time, the operational delivery and the day-to-day challenges and crises will always pull you away from that kind of deeper thinking, if you like, how you carve out your time and protect time for that and see that as important. I think there's some work to help people understand how to operate across the system. So, when we're managing a team, I hate the expression looking down, but we're looking at that team and what happens with that team. And as you move into the middle, your role almost certainly will need you to look more across the organization. You'll be relying on work and relationships and collaboration with other teams in order to achieve what you need to achieve. And so the relationship building at that level, you'll also inevitably be looking not just across but up. We'll need to be helping people think about, in our world, stakeholder engagement is a really important factor, that a skill that people need to build confidence in and be good at. You need to think about, how do things work in this organization? How do the systems align? What are the things that we become more aware of? So there are some technical skills, but there's also, as I said, this kind of mindset-y thing as well, and understanding really what your new role is. There's something about building relationships. There's always going to be something about building relationships, and I think what people have said that they're very surprised about in middle roles is the kind of the emotional labor. This isn't just a practical task. The emotional labor is to be pulled in all directions, to be trying to be all things to all people. All of that's quite emotional work. And so how do we help people both recognize that and manage that? And what's the kind of support systems that people need to be able to do that? well. And I think that's about peer groups. I think it is about problem solving type work. The use of coaches and mentors can be helpful at that point. I think, but mostly I think having people working together to try and solve the challenges. When you bring a group of middle people together, their challenges are very similar. So how do we harness the power of a group, and in doing so build a new group for who are the group that are in the middle, and are they a group themselves? And I think that can be a very supportive group for people. So I think there's something about building those kind of, helping people build those connections. And of course, some people will just go off and do that themselves. They're natural connectors, but others, maybe perhaps their role doesn't enable it quite as much, or it's not a natural innate thing. So they might, the organisation might want to think about some structures that help people do that.
And I mean, that's really interesting, the way you're saying that it's bringing people together. But I mean, often it's well recognized that often we end up working in silos. In fact, these kinds of initiatives, leadership development initiatives, are great ways of bringing people together from various different parts of the organization too, which creates connections that wouldn't otherwise have happened.
Yeah.
And I think, we see that both in external programs, but particularly in internal programs. So do you think bringing people together from outside organizations together also has a benefit, or is that sort of internal communication perhaps the more urgent need?
There can be a benefit in bringing people outside the organisation. I think, again, some of the challenges will be very similar. So knowing that this isn't just your organisation where people might have some of those challenges, I think is a comfort to you. I think there's also a context risk, though. So very often we'll look to what other organisations are doing and trying and try to perhaps bring what sounds like a great idea in, but without appreciating the difference in context. So what works well in one organisation doesn't automatically translate into another organisation. So I think there's a risk. So yes, we should all be looking outwards. We should be looking to our industries, our professions. We should be looking to other organisations, but also thinking about recognising the uniqueness that each organisation has.
Yeah. And I think it is sort of dialing up our sort of awareness of that is critical. I mean, you move from the non-profit sector into the public sector, which is perhaps not as big a jump or different mindset shift as going into a fully commercial organization. But did you sense that transition and obviously the scale of it too was part of that change?
Yeah, I think for me, the transition was the scale. So the not knowing, the suddenly being, just being a much smaller part of something. And of course, so that does things to the role that you have. So the role is much more specialized than I would have had in smaller organizations, where inevitably you end up having to be stretched across perhaps more than just one thing. So I think for me, it was more about the scale. But what's fascinating is that the challenges that managers have seem to be very similar. So again, despite what I've just said about the uniqueness of each organisation, actually the people management challenges tend to be very similar. So what served me well in other organisations has translated well across to where I am now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point. I mean, if one takes a couple of steps back and looks at the leadership literature, we're basically, when it comes to the motivators, the things that drive human beings in their roles, we're not really seeing a huge difference from what the ancient Greeks were saying. Humans are humans, and still very much sort of energized by the same things and demotivated by the same things. But what obviously changes massively is the context. And we live in a very, very different world now, obviously, to where Socrates was, but we live in a pretty different world to where we were in the 1980s, or even possibly now with AI and whatever else is where we were in the early 2000s. So the interesting thing for us, always strikes me, is the same wine, but the bottle changes the whole time. And the important thing is to make sure that we're exploring and revisiting these things in a way that makes sense to the current context. That must have changed, since you started work too.
I think so. I remember a previous leader that I'd worked with using that same expression. It's old wine in new bottles. I think that you're right. We often think, our new initiative is like not only groundbreaking and amazing, but also, is new and but the problems we're trying to solve with whatever we're trying to, the initiatives that we're building, the problems remain very, very similar.
In closing, because time is always against us, but what do you see as, you've mentioned peer groups a lot as being a really core part. I wonder, is there a sense of the amount of time people should spend reflecting on their leadership development? Do you think that increases as you get more senior through an organization? Is that something that we need to do more as our responsibilities leaders grows?
What a hard question to answer. I think
I don't want to end on an easy one.
Oh no. So I'm sure that with each transition, a new period of reflection, because so whether the transition is a new job or it's a new strategy or it's a new way of working, there's a transition there. And so with each transition and with each plan, I think we should be thinking about how we're showing up to this, how we're going to go about this, how we're going to make sure that the principles that I think most leaders hold about wanting to do things well, about integrity, about wanting to bring people with them, about whether our planned actions are actually aligned with those intentions that we had. And so I think there's probably always a need for reflection. I don't think you ever quite get it. I don't think you're ever finished.
No.
And I think with each new group that you're going to, you'll need to think about this again. So, we've all seen experiences of people that have led a group brilliantly and then moved to another role and things haven't quite worked as well for them as you might have expected. And that's got to come back to understanding that a different group in a different context. And all of that takes reflection.
It never ends. That's what's so fascinating about it, is the environment, the landscape we're in is constantly changing, and we therefore need to be able to adapt and move with it. Judy Flaschmann, thank you very much. It's been really, really fun talking to you. And if you've got any questions or thoughts, do let us know about those too. But Judy, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Roddy. It's been fascinating.